Yep.
All right, good morning. We are continuing in our section on Guthrie on the Doctrine of Atonement, and I think I marked it off because Andy handed me that yellow colored pencil last week, and we are at Costly Love.
That's where I marked.
Yeah, excellent. So it's good to have that pencil there. All right, so we began working on section 3 last week, God versus the gods, and the gods is supposed to be lowercase g. And remember, we talked a little bit last week about Israel's influence by their neighbors. Even in today's sermon, I'm preaching off of the 29th Psalm today, and we're going to talk a little bit about, within the Psalm, how the Psalm mirrors a Canaanite song. And the Israelites took that and, like to say, if they would use it to kind of give Baal props, well, the Hebrews would take it and say, you think Baal is good, but it's our God who can do this. It's our God who can do this. It's kind of like, the concept is so foreign to us about tribalism, because in the Western world, we haven't been that way for so long. It's nation, right? I mean, if you look at even Europe, how, mid 1800s, even nations are converting, solidifying their borders, Italy and Germany. And so you get this idea that our system is very different. And I think this is why when you look at nations like Afghanistan, and when it's, we try to understand what's going on over there, and I couldn't remember, I was watching kind of like a documentary on one of the news channels, and they were saying something like they had like over 50 tribes, in that one nation. And I think this is why it's so hard for us to understand, because they're all different, and it's not like us, that we have states, and yes, the states are all different, but the states are connected by the federal government, and we might not agree with everything that goes on, but there is that cohesion. And when you think about the ancient world with the tribes, with Israel, ancient Israel, that's surrounded by these other tribes, and they don't like each other, and sometimes they form alliances, and they might go to war with one tribe or a group of tribes, but it's this influence, that I think that really helped shape the Jewish law. Some of these things, when you look at some of the laws and you say, well, that's just kind of odd. Why would that law exist? And to me, it's really, in my opinion, to separate the Hebrew tribe, the Hebrews, from their neighbors. Right. Well, they do it this way, so we're going to do it this way, right?
Yeah.
And then, of course, the ultimate is things like circumcision, right? It's that external sign of an inward faith that these individuals belong to the God of Israel, right? And for the church, what's our sign?
The cross.
The cross? Excellent. Good. What else? What's sacrament?
Communion.
Communion and
Baptism.
Right.
Especially for us. Well, for the majority of the mainline Protestant denominations, it's communion and baptism, right? And baptism, it kind of replaces that idea of circumcision. The baptism is an outward sign of our inward faith that we belong to God, right? All right, so it is not the guilty, we talked about this last week, but the injured. God makes peace with us, different than the pagan religions. But even Andy brought out the good point last week that, in many ways, sometimes we are trying to do that, to be that controlling force, right? So here we are now, we're on Costly Love, and I'm going to read a section out of Guthrie's book on page 260. Costly love. If God already loves and forgives us, why atonement at all? Why did Jesus have to die to reconcile us to God? Why did not God just say, I forgive you, and let it go with that? We can catch a glimpse of the answer with an analogy in human relationships. Suppose that I have done something that betrays a friendship and hurts a friend. Suppose that I go to her and tell her how sorry I am and how bad I feel about it, and she says to me, that's okay, it doesn't make any difference. Forget it. Has she forgiven me? What she has really said is, I don't care enough about you to be bothered by anything you say or do. You are not that important to me. She also leaves me alone with the pain of my guilt, refusing to help me deal with it, put it behind me, and make a fresh beginning with her. Good-natured indulgence and casual acceptance are not forgiveness and love, but an expression of indifference and sometimes hostility. Real love and forgiveness mean caring enough to be hurt, caring enough to put ourselves in others' shoes, and sharing their guilt as if it were our own. Real love and forgiveness are costly, not in the sense that the guilty party must squeeze them out of the injured party, but in the sense that the injured party genuinely sympathizes with the guilty and shares his or her pain. Why did Jesus have to die? Why atonement? Because God cares for us too much to dismiss our sin and guilt with a flippant, doesn't matter. Because words are not enough. Action was necessary to prove that God's love and forgiveness are genuine. Because God wanted to stand with us in the loneliness and alienation we bring on ourselves when we separate ourselves from God and other people. Because it is just when God comes to our side in loneliness, alienation, and guilt that they are overcome. In the cross, God says to us, yes, it is true. You have hurt and offended me, but I still love you. Therefore, I will make your guilt and its consequences my own. I will suffer with you, for you, to make things right between us again. So, good morning again.
Right.
So when we think about costly love, right, and I like the example that Guthrie gave. When you think about it, if you're having a disagreement or you've wronged someone, and they say, it's all right, don't worry about it, no big deal. To me, the first thing that comes to my mind is someone being passive aggressive. Oh, no big deal, no big deal. You just better, watch your back, kind of thing. So so I agree with what Guthrie is saying. If someone just says it's no big deal, now, it's one thing if you can say, you forgot to call someone that night, and they say, hey, no big deal, don't worry about that. But if you really wrong someone, and you're looking for that, you're asking for forgiveness, and then they say, no big deal, it doesn't make a difference. I could see what Guthrie's talking about. It would almost seem that, well, what do you mean? How does that mean?
So you're looking for more like, I acknowledge that it did hurt me, but I still forgive you, as opposed to
yes.
I wasn't hurt to begin with.
Correct.
It didn't even matter.
Right, and I think
Right.
that's what Guthrie's getting at.
Got it.
So it's not that God, oh, yes, you did, hurt me, so I'm going to rake you over the coals and punish you, but yes, it's an acknowledgement of it. It's kind of like Jesus on the cross acknowledges what's happening to him, right?
Like, oh, you hurt me? I didn't even notice.
Right, exactly, right. 'Cause, no sweat, I'm God, I'm like, no, but it's Jesus feels the pain. And it's not just physical pain, but it's emotional pain. It's emotional pain that he's being rejected by humanity. And then it's also spiritual pain, as he feels in that slight moment of rejection, or almost like, where are you, right? The words of Jesus almost echo a psalmist. Why, where are you? Abandonment, yes.
Right.
And so you feel that. So it's not just a physical pain, but it's what's that?
Why hast thou forsaken
Yes, why have you forsaken me? Right. I mean, it's powerful stuff. I mean, so it's a physical pain. He's being crucified. It's emotional pain, but it's also spiritual pain. So And there's a pain that all the members of the Godhead feel. It's not like, and this falls into modalism, and we discussed this months ago. It's not like Jesus took one for the team, right? It's not like Jesus is isolated and the Spirit and the Father are just watching like, oh, that must really hurt. No, they feel the pain. That was one thing about Mel Gibson's Passion of the Christ, and I wasn't that big of a fan of the movie. To me, I thought it was a little extreme, gory. But I did like the imagery when Jesus is being crucified and you had that drop fall from heaven, almost like a tear, showing this link between the members of the Trinity. And I thought he did a great job with that scene. Because to me, it's to try to understand that the pain that Jesus was feeling was being felt by the Father and by the Spirit. Right? It's not just Jesus feeling this pain. It's the totality of God feels this pain of the crucifixion. So like Andy had just said, that it's God acknowledging it. Yeah, it did hurt. Yes, it does, but I forgive you. Right? It's Jesus acknowledging all this pain, and then Jesus saying, "Forgive them; they know not what they do." Right? It's not that Jesus is up there and he's like saying, "Oh, no sweat." No, I mean, he is feeling the pain and rejection and isolation and abandonment, and yet he still says, "Forgive them; they have no idea what they're doing. They have no idea what they're doing." And that's huge. That's huge. So, again, it's and I like how he uses the term flippant, no sweat, don't worry about it, which might cause us to walk away saying, "Oh, okay, I thought that was pretty bad, but I think God does acknowledge that within the story of Christ. So that's costly love, how we understand what we did and how God acknowledges, and yet God presents us with this way. With Christ and the cross, Christ's sacrifice. Now we're going to look at the wrath of God, as under C. Only in the light of the love of God, so unqualified that God is willing to pay the cost of loving, can we understand what the Bible means when it speaks of the wrath of God. In pagan religions, the wrath of the gods is an alternative to love. Their hostility can be changed to acceptance and love only after those who have offended them have been made to pay for their offenses. But if the God of the Christian faith is love, then this God's wrath cannot be an alternative to love. It must be an expression of love. The death of Jesus for our sin shows us this is true in at least 3 ways. All right? So, and keep in mind that just because we're talking about the wrath of God in this context, when we discuss the crucifixion, keep in mind this works also when you read the Hebrew Scriptures, right? It's not that, God gets angry with the Hebrews and just wipes them out. It's not like they have like 1 shot or 2 shots or 3 shots. There's always this open door for redemption. There's always this, okay, my anger has subsided. It's time to go back home. All right? So, and this, of course, and if we don't see it like that, it opens a door for heresies, right? Which I think Marcion was a big one in that ball field. Remember Marcion? I think it was Marcion who said, there's a God of the Old Testament who's just this mean old guy who likes, and that's what I love, and this is why I show the movie Bruce Almighty, right, in Movies with Purpose, because even though it's wrapped in comedy, it deals with very complex issues of how we as people understand God, right? And so Jim Carrey's character, right, when everything is going wrong, he describes God as like some big kid with a magnifying glass standing over an anthill burning off the feelers of the ants. Why? Because he can, right? And so in this capsule of humor, deals with these deep theological understandings of what God is. Huge. And it's accurate because, yes, there are many people who understand God like that, right? It's not just, we don't laugh because, wow, I've never heard that before. No, we laughed and we chuckled because, yes, there were times where, many of us sat like, oh gosh, what did I do? My life is absolutely crumbling. Did I do something to upset God, right? So that we must understand that these concepts also stretch within to the Hebrew Scriptures as well. So the wrath of God can be summed up or in at least three ways. One, the very fact that God can be angry with us means that God is interested in us and cares enough to be offended and hurt by us, right? And we've heard that expression even within terms of expressing human relationships, right? If you don't care about something or someone, whatever, you don't mean anything to me. What do I care what happens? But we tend to be upset when someone we care about does cross us or does do things to harm us because you care about that individual. It hurts. It hurts when you're wronged by someone, whether intentionally or unintentionally, on that individual's part, but it still hurts, right? And so God cares enough to be offended and hurt by us, right? We're not just these insignificant, it's not like how the Greeks or the Romans understood their gods or their pantheon to say, oh, well, we really made God mad and we didn't, do enough good things and now there's a famine and we're all going to die.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't work like that. God's wrath is an expression of God's love because it means that God cares enough to refuse to let us get by with our sin. God's not just going to give us a pass, right? And so we're going to have to, it is, God sees that, God recognizes that part. And it's not just something like, oh, sure, whatever, just do what you want. And then, because then you get the idea that God is more of an acquaintance than a friend, right? If you think about in your own life, maybe, I've had the difference between acquaintances and friends. Friends tend to get deeper within a relationship, right? If you're acting up or doing some things that you shouldn't be doing, an acquaintance might say, nah. But a friend might take the time to say, hey man, that's really not right. What's going on? Why are you acting like this? What's causing this behavior? They'll sit down with you and work through issues. 3, God's wrath is an expression of God's love because in the death of Christ, God bears the painful consequence of our sin. And this is the piece of it that many of us, that it's familiar to us, right? This is the one that, when we think about atonement, this is the one that stands out, right? Because God loves us, God bears the painful consequence, right? That's the pain, the hurt that Jesus takes for us, right? Because God loves us. So, yeah. Any questions about the wrath of God? And the wrath of God, kind of like how we went through the chapter about love and justice and love, right? They fit together, right? You can't just look at love without understanding justice, nor can you look at justice without understanding love. And Guthrie here would say the wrath of God must be understood within the context of God's love, right? Or else it would just be like that giant on an anthill with a magnifying glass, just blowing off feelers as God pleases, right? Sure. All right, so the final section under part 5 is, were you there? And this should echo, what do we think when we hear, were you there? Let's say.
Think of the hymn.
Yes, boy, you crawled right in my head. Excellent. Yeah, the hymn. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Right. It's an older hymn, very powerful hymn. I want to say it's an old spiritual. Is it an old spiritual, I think? It's
Could
very, very
well,
powerful.
Sounds like
It's
it would
very
be.
powerful. It's very moving. It's a hymn that reaches deep into your soul, because it wants to put you in that perspective, right? Because especially as Christians, yeah, we talk about the crucifixion, but we focus more on the resurrection, right? It's Easter Sunday. Yes, we do celebrate and observe Good Friday, but we really do focus on Easter Sunday a lot more, right? But every now and then, it's good to focus on this as well. So were you there? We have been thinking about what the death of Jesus means from God's side. God's taking the initiative to reconcile us to God, but it takes two parties for reconciliation to happen. Those who need to be reconciled as well as the one who reconciles. If we are to understand the meaning of the cross, then we have to ask how we are affected by what happened on Good Friday. To believe that Jesus died for us is not only to have a radical new understanding of God, but to have a radical new understanding of ourselves. More than that, it means to be different. But how are we to be different? In a sense, all the rest of this book will be an attempt to answer this question. But we must begin to answer it now. In doing so, we will pick up the questions we have kept raising about our involvement in atonement. Are we really so bad that only Jesus' death could make things right between ourselves and God? Is it fair? Is it fair for another to take the rap for us? Does it really help? Are we not still the same old dirty glasses we were before? Words are inadequate to express what Christians experience and believe at this point. But we can at least list 4 things the cross tells us about ourselves and does for and to us. So, as we break this down, we're going to hear some pieces from Guthrie. So he begins with, the cross convicts us of our sinfulness. Were you there when they crucified my Lord? Like the old hymn. Yes, we were there. What they did then, we still do. The cross of 2,000 years ago exposes the kind of people we are. Right? This is humanity. And this is why it's so important to understand, what happened. This is not just the religious leaders of the Jewish state who turn over Jesus to the Romans. It is also the Gentiles, right? I mean, it's the Romans who do the act. It's the Romans who nail him to a cross. So it kind of connects the entire world to this thing. It's the Romans who shed the blood. It's the Romans who shed the blood. So the cross convicts us of our sinfulness. And so we have 7 pieces to this one. This one is big, and this one we'll take a little bit more time with. We were there with Judas, who sold out, probably because Jesus refused to serve Judas's military and political goals for his nation. So we think about Judas, right? We were there with Judas. Because we often try to move God and mold God into how we want God to be. Think about the expression, we are created in the image of God. Theologically, that is very sound. But many times with humans, and when I say that, I mean all of us, we like to think, or we might say that out of one side of our mouth, but on the other side it's, God is made in our image. We might not say that aloud, but we try to tailor-make God, how we want God to be. And it doesn't work like that, right? Judas does this, right? Judas has an agenda. Judas tries to coerce Jesus into doing something, and it doesn't work. It blows up, right? Judas tries to paint Jesus into a corner, thinking like a cornered animal, he will come out swinging. And that does not happen, right? He paints him in a corner, the temple guards arrest him, and he goes quietly, right? So we were there with Judas. 2, we were there with the disciples who deserted him and fled when they discovered that loyalty to him meant being rejected by both the political and religious authorities, tossed in jail and perhaps killed. Why be a Christian if it does not pay off? Who wants to follow a loser, especially one who gets in trouble with the authorities? Think about that. Where were the disciples when Jesus is arrested? Only Peter follows, and Peter,
Still denies him.
Right.
yeah, because he's scared. Because he's scared. Hey, aren't you one of those Galileans? No. What do you mean? That's not true. Yeah, I saw you with... No, you didn't. Get your glasses checked. And then, of course, he denies him 3 times, and then he takes off. When Jesus is crucified, there is only one of the disciples there, and that's John. The others are not. All right, so they desert him. And we think about our own lives. There are times when we desert, when we move, when we experience fear. It happens. It's human. Now, these things, I'm not saying these things to browbeat all of us, but it's to understand this concept. Were you there? Oh, yeah. Humanity was represented there at the cross, most definitely. And this is also to understand that we can't just look at these people and say, shame on them. We would have fallen in these groups just like they did. We would have fallen in these groups just like they did. In fact, the ones who do act the way that everyone should have acted were the women.
Right.
The women were the stalwarts. They were there. They were there at the crucifixion, right? They were there to come prepare Jesus' body after the Sabbath, right? On Sunday morning. It was the women. Yeah. All right. 3, were we there when the pious leaders of the religious establishment who were out to get him because he did not act as they thought one sent from God ought to act? He criticized good law-abiding people and made friends with guilty, sinful people. He thought human beings were more important than moral and religious rules and conventions. Who can tolerate such a threat to the moral and religious foundations of our society? Think about what Jesus did. Think about his ministry. Think about who railed against him and why they railed against him. They didn't rail against him because, that's nice that Jesus thinks things differently. No, I mean, he's constantly throwing away their understandings. No, there's no need for that. I mean, there's no need for that. We've been doing it this way for thousands of years, right? Now, the churches haven't been doing it that way for thousands of years, but we understand that. We've always done it this way, right? So when you get an upstart coming in and challenging, we all feel that way. It might be young, it might be old, doesn't make a difference when, someone comes in and rocks the boat, And then one day, you will be part of the establishment and another group will come in and rock the boat. I love the line in it was Sister Act, the second one. The movies of Whoopi Goldberg when she hides out in the convents because the gangsters are trying to get her. The second movie when she's working with kids, and there's a scene when, I think it's the second one, where Maggie Smith is sitting with the Monsignor, and they're talking about how, remember when we were young and we used to get at the older Monsignor, and now they're part of the establishment. Now they are the establishment, but they open up, it's a beautiful little picture within the comedy how, hey, remember when we were the young? nuns and priests, and it was us who challenged. And I love that part because it's understanding that we look at what Jesus did, and he criticized the establishment, right? It's the powers and principalities that got after him. It's the people who had no power. They're the ones that loved Jesus. This is where the church grew in leaps and bounds, because he's not challenging anything of theirs. In fact, he's empowering them. He's saying God values you. Well, we've never heard that before. Yeah, we might hear that in the synagogue, but everyone else treats us like dirt. So think about that, right? Were we there with the pious leaders of the religious establishment who were out to get him? All right. 4, were we there with Peter when he denied him? When it is safe and words are cheap, we too confess, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. But when we are among outsiders, we are too afraid to be different. It's better to be silent, and if necessary, deny him, than to get in trouble by having convictions and attitudes that only make people mad and turn against you. Right? This is a hard one to swallow. Right? But think about us in the light of Peter and Peter's actions. And yet, maybe you can think of a time when or I think of times when I can. It's just, you think about that. Peter was human. Fear is real, right? And that emotion can be very gripping and controlling. And Peter falls to it. Yeah, but again, we can't just look at Peter and say, shame on you, Peter. No, we've all had these experiences before like Peter. It's not just Peter. It's not just Peter. Were you there when were you there with Pilate when he made the decision to let the mob have Jesus, although he knew the defendant was innocent? It is better to sacrifice Jesus than to go against the will of the majority of the people. What can you do when the choice is between justice that threatens and injustice that preserves your own comfort, power, and wealth? It is a powerful thing. It is very scary to give up these things. And so the religious leaders are in the same boat. This is why it impresses me when you have Pharisees that do turn, that choose to follow Jesus, that say, this is the path. Okay, let's do this. They are walking away from thousands of years of tradition and understanding to follow a new one.
Speaking of which, you said only the women, but Nicodemus and Joseph of Arimathea also stepped up.
They did step up, and they took, after the crucifixion.
Right.
Correct, most definitely. Most definitely. Most definitely. Most true. So it's hard. It's hard to give these things up. It's hard to walk away from these things. And Pilate is moved by the mob. And you know it. You know the moment when they say, hey, this guy calls himself king. We only have one king. Even, they're talking through their teeth. We only have one king. That's Caesar. They could care less. They hate Caesar.
Right.
But by saying that, and they say, aren't you a friend of Caesar's? It's like, for Pilate to land in that region of the world, he wasn't on Caesar's A-list to begin with. So it's like, do we need to remind him of what you're doing, of who this guy Jesus says he is? So they he buckles. He buckles. And which is really interesting, because Pilate, within the scriptures, is not some, light-handed person. He is extremely violent at times, but maybe he's in fear, like, this mob is way too big and this is going to go very awry if I don't do what I need to do.
Right.
Or what I don't want to do. So, yeah. So he allows other people to push his hand, right? And I think this is the symbolism in why he washes his hands after the act. Mm-hmm. Yes, he did it, but to wash his hands of it, to say, this is on you, but it's really not.
Right.
It's on the leaders, and it's on him too, right? That blood, I always think about Lady Macbeth, out dang spot, and she's washing her hands, and she can't get it out. That blood is on her hands. And just like with Pilate, and of course the church, one of the church traditions is that Pilate was moved, I think he lived the end of his life out in Switzerland, is one of the church traditions, and that he went insane. So we don't know. I mean, but this is a church tradition, that's what happened. And remember, kind of like Julius Caesar, and I wonder if he borrowed this from the Bible when he talks about Julius Caesar's wife saying to Julius, "Don't go to the forum today. Bad things are going to happen."
Yeah.
Even Pilate's wife warns him
Right.
not to crucify him.
Yeah, don't
She had
mess
a
with
dream.
this guy.
Don't do it. Don't do it. Yeah, exactly. And Romans were extremely superstitious. He should have, and this would have been a good opportunity for them to follow the superstition. All right, 6. We were there when the soldiers who played games while he died. We all, while many of us enjoy all the pleasures of American affluence within a few blocks of where we live, not to mention across the world, children go to bed hungry at night, strangers are excluded, not only from benefits of our civil society, but also from churchgoers, from our churches. Sick people are unattended, lonely, elderly people are forgotten or ignored. Prisoners sit alone in darkness, according to Jesus himself. When they suffer, he suffers too. What we do or leave undone with them, we do or leave undone with him. So this picture paints a picture of comfort for the church, right? And I think Guthrie brings up American affluence is because Guthrie's an American, right? This is his worldview, right? So you can only speak to what you know. So he's speaking to this and saying, look, we sit there and look at the soldiers doing what they're doing, and yet we forget people all the time. It's kind of like saying like the sins that we have done or the sins that we have not done, right? Or the sin is sometimes what we leave undone.
Sin of omission, right?
Right, the sin of omission, right? So whether we turn our heads, whether we ignore, and we've all been in these places, we've all stepped over people on sidewalks, we've turned our heads, and this is what Guthrie is saying. This too is bad. By doing these things, by forgetting people who need help, and he reminds us of the parable of the sheep and the goats. When you don't do it, when you don't take care of the least of these, you do it to me. You do it to Jesus. You're not tending me when you don't do it. So this one, I think, really stings at times because, and we've seen this represented in pop culture. Not doing this song, but I know Brandi Carlile has a song where she talks about not caring for the stranger at my door. And I don't know if it's meant to be theological, but of course, as a minister, I always look at things in this theological tint, and I'm like, it's just the stranger at your door, someone who needs help. And then fear, of course, controls us too. Well, I don't know who this is. Maybe they're going to hurt me, and that is a possibility. But
Especially today.
Especially today. But there are still people who hurt, who are hungry, so so we can be like also the soldiers who played games while he died. And the final piece, and this will be the end of our section today, we were there. The cross of Jesus exposes not just their sin back then and there, but our sin here and now. When we read about them, we read about ourselves. Those of us who are willing to let ourselves be told this will not even think of going on with defensive questions and arguments about whether we are as bad as some people or so bad that the atoning death of Christ was really necessary. We can only ask how we can be changed from this kind of people that we are to become new and different people. Is it possible that only the death of what we are can make a new life possible? So Guthrie ends with one that kind of really pops it in your face to say, look, him dying on a cross was not just for the people then. It's for the people who were going to come well after them, which puts us in that perspective as well. It's all of us. It's all of humanity, right? Yes, its sins are bad enough to put him for this to happen, and it's our sins too. It's just like the saying that Reformed Christians will say, when people ask me, when did I, trying to think how the expression goes. Oh, when was I saved? When were you saved? Expecting like, when I was 19, and the proper way to respond to that in the Reformed tradition is 2,000 years ago when Jesus died on the cross. Yeah, when Jesus died on that cross and resurrected, I was saved. Meaning that I didn't do anything.
Right.
He did everything. He did everything. But that's when I was saved. So my sins now, 2,000 years after, are included within this. All of ours are. All of ours are. So that's, I really like this section, and this is why I wanted to make sure I read these things on this first section, because I love how Guthrie ties us in with these different players within the narrative of the crucifixion. That it's not just Peter. It's not just Pilate. It's not just Judas. It's not just the soldiers. It's not just the disciples who abandoned him. It's us too. It's us too. So when we read the Bible, it's very easy to say, oh, God, look at I would never have done that. And my thing is, be careful. You don't know if you would have been strong enough. You don't. Because when faced with the idea, I could be arrested just like Jesus, as Peter is sitting there warming himself by the fire, most definitely he could have been arrested like Peter, like Jesus. Let's not forget he lopped off the ear of the Malchus, cuts his ear off, because that was Peter, So sure, bad things could have happened to Peter, but we don't find out what could have happened because he tucks and runs. But the difference is he comes back, and when we talk about forgiveness, what does Jesus say? Does Jesus say to Peter, no sweat, Pete, don't worry about it? No. What does he do?
Gives him the evil eye.
He says, do you love me, Pete? Of course.
It's like my wife talks
Take care of my
about
sheep.
her mother.
Oh.
When you got the look, you
Be
knew
the
you were
look.
in trouble.
You knew you... Yeah, in ways not, yes, because he asked him 3 times. Do you love me, Peter? 3, and then a third time he says, yes, why do you keep asking? You know I do. Because he's hurt. Because Jesus wants him to understand. Look, if you're going to follow me, things can get rough. You have to understand that, right? But he does. But he lets him back in. But he doesn't just say, yeah, sure, no sweat, don't worry about it. No. Do you love me, Pete? Yes, I do. Tend my sheep. Or he says, 3 things like tend my sheep, feed my sheep, care for my sheep, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
But he wants him to understand. So he just doesn't let him off the hook.
Right.
Peter squirms for a little bit about it. But if he does forgive him, he loves him.
Right.
He just wants him to understand that you're going to have to toughen up. If you're called to be my disciple and then to be my apostle, you're gonna be faced with things.
And knowing that you're going to probably end up like I did.
Yeah, you're right, and that discussion happens right after that.
Yeah.
Because remember, he talks about, he's like, look, someone's gonna put a rope around you and lead you where you do not want to go, outstretch your hands.
Yeah.
And then, I love Peter. I do. I love him so much. And then he says, well, what about him? And he's talking about John. What's going to happen? Don't worry about it. Worry about your own house, right? Right? How many times does someone say, worry about the man in the mirror, right? Don't worry about him. We're dealing with you right now. All right. So next week we will finish this section and we will push on into our next. So I think we'll knock out this section next week.